at the end of the day, what we look for is what any retail banker looks for. You say to yourself, do I want to do business with these people? Are they trustworthy?
Hello, and welcome back to Agents of Impact, a podcast from ImpactAlpha. I'm David Bank, editor and CEO, and that was Clara Miller, an original Agent of Impact. Clara joined ImpactAlpha contributing editor Rob Brown for another in our series of Finding Alpha conversations with asset owners and allocators. Hi, Rob. Welcome back.
Well, hi, David. It's great to be back.
You know, Clara has been a mentor and teacher for so many people in the impact investing community, including me. She taught us all accounting is destiny, which actually undergirds much of the discussion around impact management.
Yes, it does, David. And, you know, Clara Miller was an impact investor long before it was even called impact investing. Among other accomplishments, Clara was the founder and the president of the nonprofit finance fund. She was president of the Heron Foundation, and she's also been an advisor to SASB, to the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, and to the Impact Management Project. And my favorite, as we will all hear, among her proudest accomplishments was her early support for a beloved cash-strapped bar on the Lower East Side of Manhattan.
I'm eager to hear that story. And before we jump in, let me remind our listeners you can see all of the shows in the Impact Alpha podcasting network at impactalpha.com, and you can subscribe to Impact Alpha on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Why not sign up for our free weekly newsletter, Impact Alpha Open? Or go all in and subscribe to Impact Alpha to get our daily brief in your inbox each morning and many other cool features. Okay, let's jump right in.
Clara, it's a true privilege to be here with you. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Rob. I'm thrilled to be here.
Let's start by talking about your own journey. You didn't start with a degree in finance, and you didn't even start in a related field. So tell us, how did it all get started, and why did it all get started?
Well, first, the how, I guess. I'm not sure it was a logical progression, and in fact, I can guarantee it was not. I was an art major in college after a hiatus, which will go unexplored for these purposes, and I majored, as I said, I majored in art at college, and then graduated to a series of jobs, which included being a clerk typist at the Bureau of Sport, Fisheries, and Wildlife in Boston, being a library assistant, and possibly most important for power dynamics, having flunked the typing test at the National Academy of Sciences, being a receptionist. Now, I know that most people don't feature those kinds of jobs on their resumes, but I can tell you they kind of don't exist anymore, and they are very important in understanding a little about organizations, and so I just wanted to mention them for that reason. After grad school, I got my first sort of real professional relevant job to this discussion, and it was as an economic development planner in the southern tier central region of New York State, where they were losing jobs, as they still are, where natural gas was an important resource for the glass packaging industry, which was huge there at that time, and where the economic development powers that be thought that doing a renewable energy program would be a really good idea because it could replace natural gas, which was going up in price, and et cetera. So long story short, we created mapping and planning resources for this, a citizens level discussion around it, and a loan fund to finance energy conservation projects and throughout the three-county region. I knew absolutely nothing about what I was doing, which is, I think, really important for someone who is starting up a nonprofit social enterprise of any type, whether it's in government or not. And gradually kind of recovered from ignorance over time, and that really could be the banner headline of my career is I recovered from my stupid mistakes. From there, I was recruited to the New York Community Trust, where I became a staff member and then later the program manager of their Energy Conservation Fund, they called it. And that was that was where I met nonprofit organizations, buildings, finance, and how those things interacted. And so that was sort of the first job in New York. And from there, NFF arose, and from there I went to Heron. And that's sort of the short version of a very long story.
But it is an instructive story, I think, because as you said, starting from ignorance is sometimes the best place to start because it forces you to learn things that you might not have otherwise learned. So what are those lessons early on in your career that you took while you were making that transition from someone who is, your words, ignorant, to someone who was highly talented and motivated?
Well, I can say that listening to people and paying attention to organizational dynamics, seeing how enterprises of all types and sizes do and don't work. That's what one gets to observe if you're in the sort of bottom of the engine room as a junior chipmunk, which is what I was at the National Academy of Sciences. I was
not just a chipmunk, a junior chipmunk.
I was a junior chipmunk. I didn't even rise to the level of senior chipmunk, and it's kind of freeing in a way. You don't have to, you can sense and understand office politics, but you do not, because you don't have power exactly, you sort of have a different kind of power. And you get to observe organizational dynamics if you want. If you go in as a really smart young thing who is, at the middle to top, you never get to see how stuff gets done in an organization exactly. And I think that's an important step. I think that if I had, and as my social worker daughter likes to put it, Mom, you're an experiential learner, which just means you have to try stuff and fail at it before you actually learn anything. So that's part of what's at play.
And I would imagine you also learned very quickly the value of humility.
Well, yeah, yes. Both the value of humility and what's the way to put this? The ability of of people who are at the bottom of the pyramid to see things that those at the top, and to understand things that those at the top don't. And as a chief executive, this is extraordinarily valuable because you ignore people in the trenches at your peril, I think, just as a manager.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you related to me once a story about Oliver Wesson. You want to describe that?
So this was when I was at Nonprofit Finance Fund, and we were embarking on the first kind of syndicated financing and loan. We wanted to expand. We had this very nice sort of retired banker helping us out, and he had contacts. But Morgan at that time had established a community development corporation. This was the old J.P. Morgan before it became part of J.P. Morgan Chase and Chemical Bank and those old things. And Oliver was the first, he was a Morgan-trained investment banker. He had been in London, I think, And he was brought in to run their community development corporation because uh, the the bank, which was an investment bank, there had been a ruling in the recent past that showed that it had to comply with the Community Reinvestment Act. This sent a shockwave through the investment banking world and the trust banking world because they had thought of this as sort of retail bank territory. So anyway, JP Morgan said, fine, we're going to do it. Brought in Oliver. Oliver and I were having lunch at the JP Morgan headquarters in downtown Manhattan. And I had gone to the meeting with my usual attitude about retail banks, which was, okay, it's going to be like maybe a $3,000 to $5,000 grant. We're going to have to put their banner on the podium and let their executive vice president for street banking speak. And then we're going to have their name imprinted on the 3-ring binder. And we're going to have to. And so I was sort of ready for that conversation. And I got there and I thought, oh boy, and sat down at lunch. And Oliver looks across at me and says, how do we help you meet your growth needs? And that was just the way he would have treated any customer in investment banking. But I was utterly unprepared. I had never thought that thought. I had never been asked that question by any funder or banker. I had never thought of growth needs as being different from help, we need money to make payroll next week. And so it was a real sea change for me. And from then on, I started saying, and neither have most nonprofit executives who are in my kind of cohort. This is unheard of in the sector, the idea of thinking of growth needs separately from other needs, the idea of growth capital or change capital, or the difference between capital and just plain revenue. All of those things were unheard of in nonprofit land.
And that really set the stage, as I understand it, for the work that you did going forward and the structures that you put in place for many of the nonprofits that you then subsequently started to grant money to.
Well, yeah, I mean, at NFF, this was when we were at NFF, quite early in the process, and we were all about lending. And while lending can be definitely part of growth, it's different from equity or capital that is that is basically equity or growth capital, what for-profits have on their balance sheet that goes directly into their balance sheet and funds, let's say, deficits on the way to a new business model, which is a bigger organization, a different organization, new products, whatever it is. And this just didn't exist. So from that moment on, I realized, well, there's something here that's not being fulfilled by lending only, that is about healthy growth in the nonprofit sector that the for-profit sector takes for granted on some level. And so we can't just keep on keeping on, kind of faking it till we make it, and imagining that loans all by themselves can meet growth needs. Because loans are about reliable, visible, repeatable revenue, which of course is pure gold. You have that and the capital will come, right? Growth is a different animal. Sometimes you can do that with loans, but sometimes it really takes capital that is more patient, less time bound, has just a different flavor, as we put it.
Now, of course, thinking about equity capital in the construct of a nonprofit is a little odd, or at least it was at that time.
No, it is.
How did you convince people that it was a good idea to think that way?
Well, I haven't yet. Heavens knows I've tried, but I think it's because there are lots of blocks. One of them is Well, you can't own a nonprofit. So how can you sell shares in a nonprofit? You know, nonprofits, if you go out of business, they'll belong to the state of New York, in New York City. How can you say this? And the response is, well, no, it's not like shares, but it is fund. It means funds that serve exactly the same purpose in a nonprofit enterprise as they serve in a for-profit. It's just that you can't own the shares. But the board of directors are the kind of equity holders for this enterprise, this nonprofit enterprise. And for it to grow in a healthy way, it needs that flavor of capital often, even though that board or the general public are not going to own shares in the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, right? So
Oh, that's a good one.
that was one of our early loans. Great organization. Anyway, so
You want to tell us about that?
about Nuyorican Poets Cafe.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a fantastic, very beloved organization on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. That is a presenting venue for poetry slams, young poets, music, variety of other things, and came to us for a loan for its building because when NFF started out, it was the Nonprofit Facilities Fund. We did lots of buildings, and that's a lot of history there. But we came at it by looking at the building. And so they said, look, we are operating illegally. And so we can't really go to a bank for financing. But we need to put, panic hardware on our door. We need to do these various things to be able to operate legally to get a TCO, technical certificate of occupancy or something like that. So they said, so would you lend us the money to do this? And I thought, well, let me go down. And, one of the things one does is to go and look at the place and talk to people. And it was, it was way down on the Lower East Side. I'm sure they said, we have crowds that exceed, our occupancy. And I went to a performance and sure enough, that was the case. But more importantly, they had a bar. And, if you have that kind of cash flow that is reliable, poetry slams, yeah, pretty good audience. A bar, cash on the barrelhead. And so we thought, let's just figure out a way that we can lend into their operations without necessarily putting a lien on anything, but, essentially doing a loan that was dependent partly on the revenue from the bar, as opposed to worrying about the people coming in the door. And turned out great. It's still operating.
So you basically gave an unsecured loan to an illegal bar on the Lower East Side.
Hey, I could
As
do
one
that
of your
business all day long, let me tell you.
What did that teach you about taking risk?
Cash is king. It's one thing. And looking for reliable cash flow is good, and looking for that source is important. In a way, they're all story loans if you're doing that kind of lending, or character loans. So you want to be comfortable with the people you're doing business with. If you're not, you should listen to that little voice that says, this guy's, he's telling me a story. I'm not comfortable. I guess with loans, and in that case, you kind of sample their wares. You go to you drop in on a performance. Are there people there? Are they happy? What's the what's the vibe? I mean, it's that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that's exactly what
Mm-hmm.
retail bankers did all day long in that era, in New York City, which of course was the early '80s.
So Clara, quickly then, if we follow the arc of your career, you went from a small pool of capital at NFF to a much larger pool of capital at Heron. And what did you learn about investors when you suddenly had more to work with, if you will?
Well, we went from a small pool of capital at NFF to let's say, to a larger pool of capital at NFF. And then at NFF, it was about 100 million. We were a grantee and a borrower from Heron. And then went to Heron, where the pool of capital was 300 million, which was a lot, but in some contexts, not so much. And certainly no bigger than some pretty good sized CDFIs or community banks or whatever it was. And the thing that was so compelling and interesting about the foundation was that the portfolio was invested up and down the capital market. In NFF, all of our investments, if they weren't in the bank, in CDs or whatever it was, were invested in nonprofit organizations in their debt. So that was very different. And so there were public company stocks, there was private equity, there was just a whole range of things. And the staff and board at Heron had for years been going down the path of aligning its assets more thoroughly with its mission, and had been extremely creative doing that. And by the time I arrived, we're at about 40% aligned for mission. And McKinsey told them, they did a study, that if they did any more than 40% aligned for mission, they would go into the dreadful spend down category. In other words, the corpus or the endowment or the capital base would start losing value. And that was a no-no from the IRS. The IRS then requires that you follow certain rules when you're starting to lose purchasing power. And so they kind of stopped at 40%, although I don't think it was a hard line. I think it was something that they were investigating. And so when I arrived, the real opportunity, I would say, was to say, well, why not 100%? I mean, you guys have done great with 40%. Why would it be any different if you kept going? And in fact, and so that's what we did. And I think, and so part of the excitement, and we did it in many different ways and many flavors of capital, many types of investments. And the interesting thing also, I think, maybe even more interesting, was that we changed the business model of the foundation. And by that I mean, on most foundations, have a bright line separation between the investment staff, which is over here, over yonder, and consists of investment professionals who are putting money out at competitive rates for maximum risk-adjusted return. It's quite conventional. It's not clear whether it's good or bad for the world, or whether anybody's examined whether it is or not. And then on the other side of the house are the grant makers, who are idealistic, mission-driven, very interested in making grants to various, either nonprofits, sometimes for-profit social enterprises. But look at it, that grant making is where the mission magic happens. And on the other side of the house, just don't look over there, and vice versa. So, it's like, your brain is split in the middle, and, you're not allowed to go back and forth. And so we said, why do that? Why not just have one staff? People have skills in both areas. We have conversations about the mission on both sides. We have conversations about the money on both sides. Each side benefits from the expertise of the other, and each side also benefits from the information of the other. And especially at Heron, where the mission was to help people and communities help themselves out of poverty, there was no question at all that our undertaking from a mission point of view had to do with the whole economy. And that there was no sort of good economy over here where, the mission stuff happened, and then a bad economy over here where the just bad stuff happened. Instead, the people we wanted to help were in the real economy. And in the wake of the financial crisis, of course, even though our portfolio, the Heron portfolio that had been built up painstakingly by the Heron Foundation over years, performed better than any asset on the balance sheet, by far. And so, everybody was quite self-congratulatory about that. Gee, these bonds we've structured that have, that last for the lifetime and the ownership of the house, and people are still in their homes. All of that kind of stuff didn't matter to what was going on outside our, what I like to call our terrarium, our little place where we have our grantees and our little, loans and whatever we have. But out there, the kind of, predatory lending or, various other things led to the greatest stripping of assets from the poor and middle class in American history. And for an enterprise whose goal is to help people in communities help themselves out of poverty, if we didn't pay attention to what was happening outside our walls, we weren't doing our job. So that's when we said we've got to do everything. We have to have the entire, everything has to be at stake, or we're not really in the game.
Mm-hmm. So you said importantly that your portfolio held up very well during the great financial crisis. What was it about the way you structured those loans, or the approach that you took to granting loans, or however you want to describe it, that actually enabled that better performance?
Well, I cannot in any way take credit for that. That happened before I arrived at Heron, and it was undoubtedly, the great team at Heron, which preceded me and followed me, I can say, and who structured those loans for affordability over the lifetime of the loan for a specific group of people. And I think that if, for example, if the bankers can talk to the people in the field, I mean, in that particular instance, it was clear to CDFI lenders well before the financial crisis that something weird was going on. What was happening was people who they rejected for loans were going down the street, and they knew perfectly well, these guys didn't have jobs, they didn't have credit, they didn't, they were buying a house that was way too big for them anyway, or whatever it was. But they were getting the loans. And imagine if instead of just kind of saying, oh, that's really weird, imagine if they had been talking to the other side of the house, which they were at Heron, But imagine that had been happening, in banks. I don't know what was happening in banks. They were kind of in a place that, that was divorced from the street level, from the retail level. And so that was extremely good information to have. And maybe the whole financial crisis could have been fixed or stopped, or somebody would have said, wait a minute, why are we lending to all these folks who aren't going to be able to pay back the loans? Maybe they deserve some sort of loan, but let's figure out what's affordable, because Heron did that. And it was a perfectly, it may not have been a predatory return, but it was a perfectly good return on capital for housing loan. So,
Well, I think as the world learned the hard way during that crisis, when your incentive for making the loan is distinct from your incentive for holding the loan, in other words, you syndicate it out and sell it to somebody else, you don't really care about the creditworthiness of the
Right.
borrower, because you've gotten paid and somebody
That's
else
right.
is taking the risk.
that's right. There's no, I think
Unfortunately.
that, if there had only been a rule that you have to hold the loans for 2 years or something like that, that a lot of
Yeah.
those shenanigans might have been avoided.
hmm So I want to pivot, Clara, to your specific thoughts on investing, because this is, after all, a podcast about finding alpha. And I wonder if we could start by you describing your mental model, if you will, for your team's approach to making an investment or making a loan, and how you see yourself enabling your team and helping the right outcome become reality.
Yeah, it's interesting so I'm going to talk historically. Obviously, I'm not
Yes.
Heron now and haven't been for a number of years. But when we did, when we structured an investment portfolio, I talked about what kinds of exposures we are looking for. We had a very wide berth. It was helping people in communities help themselves out of poverty. This is the whole economy is one's exposure potentially, right? And we took full advantage of that up and down the organization. But at the same time, one of the things we're looking for is, because we had a relatively small staff, we started by looking for other people we could have doing our homework to some extent, right? We didn't necessarily want to find the perfect loan for us and then bring it in and do all the due diligence and make sure that the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. What we really wanted to do was to say, oh gosh, Ford Foundation has already worked these guys over. Or can we do a syndicated loan with somebody whom we trust, who is a trustworthy investor? So that was one kind of overarching theme, was to try to do things in concert with others in the economy rather than inside our walls as if it's all about us. And I think that's something that's worth considering for anybody in a foundation or anybody doing investing. Banks certainly do that all the time because they want to keep their transaction costs down, not only for themselves, because it makes their business work better financially, but also for their borrowers. Because, if you have to deal with 29 banks, it's a real expensive pain in the neck. If you only deal with one lead bank who is speaking for everybody, that's a lot easier. So both for the point of view of our investees and from the point of view of us as a relatively small player, we wanted to find others to play with. But, really, at the end of the day, what we look for is what any retail banker looks for. Uh, you you say to yourself, do I want to do business with these people? Are they trustworthy? Do they get mad if I ask a question? You know, it's you're dealing with a person, with people, and that is if you're doing retail work, which we were in many cases for direct investing and lending, um, we'd be looking at the people first. Um, we'd be looking at whether they were they did or were very familiar with their market and they could talk about it fluently. Um, we'd be looking at the enterprise, the whole enterprise. I think that some philanthropic investors look at projects. We were typically an enterprise, whole enterprise lender, or or investor, or or fund investor more likely. Um, we were looking to see an economic impact that helped people who were low income. And that often meant, for example, that we wouldn't have privileged a startup, even though I know a lot of foundations do, and job creation was always a metric that irritated me because, of course, somebody can create a job and then it goes away. And if you're a startup, you have a greater than 90% chance that's going to go away. So if we're standing as surrogates for our folks we want to help, then getting a job at a startup is putting risk on your beneficiaries. Um, as a foundation, as a charitable foundation, I think our duty of care, our fiduciary duty, our beneficiaries are the people we want to help. And so we need to be always looking to stand for their best interest in a transaction. How is this enterprise going to be good for the folks we want to help? Whether the folks who are starting the business, whether they're beneficiaries of the business, whatever that looks like. Um, anyway, so I think that's pretty much where we go. And then, it can be geographically, it was always US. There were various things like that that were just, because of our charter, we're going to be.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So if you had just one piece of advice, if there was only one you could offer, and I know you've got many more, but if you had one piece of advice you could offer to someone who was pitching you on an idea, what would it be?
Do a market study. Where is your reliable revenue going to come from? What is my capital? What is the reliable revenue our capital is going to help you attract? And where does it live in the market? And who are your competitors and all those other things? Because at the end of the day, you're looking at revenue is the thing you're looking to enable. And if the revenue is flowing, the capital will come. It's not like you just need capital so you can struggle through for 3 years and then come up with a new miracle in 3 years to fund all your programs. You're really looking for another source of revenue in order to create more sustainability in your world and more mission. And so if you don't have both of those things together, then you're looking for the wrong thing in capital. You really should be looking for revenue.
That's great advice, and it's advice that surprisingly many people don't seem to want to take on board.
Right. Right. I mean, I've heard a lot of,
So-
well, there isn't any market, of course. I wouldn't be doing this if there was a market. And, that's
That's
not-
right. I'm creating the
exactly.
market, which very few people in the history of business have ever truly done.
Exactly. Usually it's the federal government that creates something that then somebody says, there can be this can be scaled as a market, like the internet, for example.
So I want to change gears a little bit, talk about impact investing broadly. Maybe a few quick questions. So this is a perennial question, but I do want your perspective. Does there have to be a trade-off between impact and return?
No, of course not. That it's a false dichotomy. It's kind of, it's you can find things with a high return and a low impact, and you can also find things with a low return and a high impact. Or a high return and a high impact. You can do a 4x4 matrix and have high and low impact in one side and high and low return in the other, and have something in each box. And so I think it's been linked because it's convenient for some people to help to make that argument. And it's not true. It hasn't been true in our experience, certainly not at Heron. Certainly Roy Swan and his work at Ford these days, that is not even vaguely true. He's getting something like 26 IRR in his fund. I'm thrilled to say. It's kind of thrilling. But he's not the only one. There have been exposures from time immemorial where, it's you're doing something good for society and you're getting a decent return.
I think every traditional endowment manager or foundation manager would be jealous of what you just said about Roy.
Yeah. Yes, they should be.
They should be.
They should
Exactly.
be asking Roy how he did it.
Yeah.
And
Well, with all due respect, and he deserves it to Roy, let's see how he continues to do.
absolutely right. It was
Yeah.
when at Heron, as I think I said before, we expected, I don't know, to go to hell in a handcart based on what McKinsey had said, of course. But in fact, what happened to the Heron returns after we had arrived at 100% for mission was that we went from the second quartile in performance for a foundation in our size cohort, to the first quartile. And as far as I know, have pretty much stayed there. Now, it might have been just the performance of the stock market and the asset allocation in our portfolio. I don't know. But, I think that it is a false dichotomy. It's, yes, you can do that. You can, basically get into a private equity vehicle and never leave forever and think of that as somehow better because it comes out with such a high return, even though sometimes it doesn't. Or you can try to actually, justify the impact on your beneficiaries of how you're making your investment, which I think is at the heart, as I've said, of fiduciary duty.
Do you think it's important to quantify that impact that you're having on your beneficiaries?
I think the reality is that investors, it's not investment typically that has as much impact as the enterprises themselves. So just from a mechanical point of view, we're investing in enterprises. The enterprises are having impact. Our funds have impact on the enterprises, and we might want to place them in the enterprises to help the enterprise do something great for the world. And in that way, yeah, our money can have an impact. And the bigger it is, the more impact it might have. There is it's all about leverage. But I think we have to be careful about, taking credit for having impact with our money when it's many times removed from the zone, what I call the zone of control. And so a lot of the measurement schemes, I think, are not helpful either to the enterprise managers or, at the end of the day, really to the foundations, because there has to be a bigger, did the air quality actually improve in Kansas, when you funded this wind turbine? That would be a more interesting metric to me than did the wind turbine make a difference? Because I think it's really, it ends up being really bad science, frankly.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with you there. The way it should be framed is, what have you done relative to the existing counterfactual?
And also, what is useful to the enterprise? What is it already saying and doing? Because if you're counting on the enterprise to have an impact, then it's already going to be collecting information. I don't think the foundation should be making up a whole new scheme for itself. And I also think people in the field should be using the same metrics, but that's another one. That's another big discussion. Anyway.
And that does get to your work at SASB.
Yes, it does indeed.
So what do you think is next in the world of impact investing? Big picture, broad perspective.
What's next? What is next? Well, I'm working on a project that has to do with making the idea of enterprise capital central to the way the social sector thinks about financing and funding organizations. And that's not because I think enterprise capital in the nonprofit world is going to be a big financial instrument necessarily in the way that private equity is in the for-profit world. Although, who knows? There is some pretty creative stuff available out there in warrants and other kinds of things that people do. But it's a real whole. And so, from my point of view, I think this would make a big difference if foundations looked at their role not as providing revenue primarily, because that's what they do. They're buyers. They're not capital investors. But if they took their grant budgets and thought of them as enterprise capital for the growing or changing organizations in their portfolios, meaning nonprofits primarily, it would be an amazing financial role that they would be taking on. Right now, grant makers have no financial role. They don't think of things that way. They think of this as, okay, we want to, how much do you think this project is going to cost? Okay, I have $50,000. Magically, it costs $50,000. And there's lots of things that could be better in the nonprofit world. And one of them are the practices of foundations around this financial instrument, really, and how the foundations might see their role. Because foundations don't really have enough money to be buyers of social programs or any kind of nonprofit programs. The total in all the foundation endowments, if tomorrow morning everybody decided to empty their endowments and just spend it all down, it would be a little bit over a year of the K through 12 public school budget, 14 months or something like that.
1
and
year.
Then it'd be gone. Yeah, then it'd be gone. And so how do we use this precious resource? This isn't, and how can we figure out a way where all of it is having an impact on mission, where all of it is focused on things that will try to change the world in some way?
And is that something that people can learn more about and support right now?
Yes. Yes, well, I've just started as a visiting scholar at the New York Federal Reserve Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And Andrea Levere, who also is a scholar there, has started a program called, or a organization called Capital for Good. And the idea behind it is to make enterprise capital a standard product, a standard practice
Mm.
in the foundation world, in the banking world, et cetera. And to explore that, to figure out how it works, to bring people in, and so we're kind of buddies on that, and it's something I've written about over the years. So I'm hoping uh, just this one aspect might make a lot of folks' lives easier.
Well, that
And
is fantastic, and it's something that I support as well. So thank you for sharing that, Clara,
yay! Thank you.
for sure. So this has been a real treat. I think it's been extremely informative for me and for our investors that subscribe to Impact Alpha. Before we go, I like to have a speed round.
Uh-oh.
So 10 questions. You ready?
Uh-oh, yes, okay, I guess so.
Okay. Favorite vegetable to grow?
Oh, oh gosh, tomatoes.
Favorite vegetable to eat?
Um, so slow. Favorite, oh God, there's so many wonderful vegetables. Okay, broccoli rabe. I like slightly bitter stuff. It's genetic.
Clara, you and I are 100% aligned there. Although I will remind you, and I know you know this as a gardener, a tomato is a fruit, not a vegetable.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, favorite artist?
Oh, God. Um, I've been, well, this is very hard for me. Very hard. I don't want to say Dürer because now I've moved on. It might be, oh, geez, this is so hard.
It's a speed round, Clara.
Okay, it's a speed round. Vermeer.
All right. Favorite author?
Okay, right now, my favorite author is William Baumol, who wrote a book called The Cost Disease, which everybody in the nonprofit sector and the impact investing sector should read. Also some by William Bowen, by Robert J. Flanagan. Super important. That's all I'll say, since it's the speed round.
All right. Best recommendation for a New York City tourist?
Highline.
Fill in the blank. I'd rather be doing...
Gardening.
Who's your childhood idol?
Ooh, childhood idol, other than the Beatles, I guess. Childhood idol, God. My uncle's-
John, Paul, Ringo, or George?
Well, I started with Paul, but then I went to John. What can I say?
And what was the best advice that your parents gave you?
Oh, my grandmother. Take responsibility for your gifts. I was a very, I don't think naughty girl is exactly the right thing, but I was an indifferent student, let's put it that way. And a variety of other things, which I won't go into right now, since it's the speed round.
Well, somewhere along the way, Claire, I think we all have a lot to thank your grandmother.
Yeah, me too. That's just the beginning of what I have to thank her for.
Amen. Well, thank you, Clara. This has been a wonderful interview. It's been a fantastic chat, and I hope the rest of your day goes as well as the beginning.
Well, thank you, and it was great to see you, Rob. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing that conversation to us, Rob. What stood out most for you?
Well, so many things, David. Clara's one of my favorite people. She's a lovely person, and she's always looking to do good in the world. But what stands out to me in the podcast, and frankly, as anyone who knows her would attest, you would not want to be on the other side of a negotiating table from her.
Well, that's a testament. And that's going to do it for this Agents of Impact podcast. Thanks to Clara, to Rob, and to all of our listeners, and to our producer, Isaac Silk. We'll be back with more conversations soon. In the meantime, go to impactalpha.com and subscribe to our award-winning daily brief to get it in your inbox each morning. I think you'll find it valuable. Till next time, I'm David Bank.